Welcome to Mystery Stories. We love a good cryptid, and, well, today we're going deep on the Mothman.
Oh, yeah, the Mothman. Have you
Huh.
heard about this one?
I have heard of the Mothman, yeah.
So it's this creature, right, with glowing red eyes seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia
Right.
back in the 60s. And there's even this connection to a tragic bridge collapse.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, and it really captures the imagination.
Huh.
The Mothman, it's more than just a scary story.
Right.
It really gripped Point Pleasant, and to this day, people are still talking about the Mothman.
So let's start at the beginning with the first sightings, right?
Yeah, so the very first sighting,
1966.
it was November 15th, 1966.
Okay.
Two couples
Yeah.
driving near an old munitions plant, the TNT area they call
Oh,
it,
wow.
and they reported seeing this thing.
This thing.
Yeah, it was massive, like 7 feet tall.
Oh, my gosh.
Huge EE wings, 10-foot span at least.
Wow.
And the detail that really gets you are the glowing red eyes.
Yeah, I bet that was scary. Oh, yeah, you're driving down this dark road, and suddenly there it is rising up in front of you,
That would be terrifying.
and the eyes just piercing through the darkness.
Oh, wow. I can only imagine.
Yeah.
But, there were a lot of reports that followed that first one.
Right. It wasn't just a one-off.
Yeah.
There were so many sightings, and these details, they started to, solidify.
Really?
Yeah, people kept describing the same thing.
Like what kind of details?
A humanoid shape, but often it was hard to see in the dark.
Okay.
Some said it had no head or you couldn't make out the head.
Interesting.
But the eyes, the glowing red eyes, they were always there. That was a constant in every report.
That's so creepy.
Yeah, and some people said they felt hypnotized by the eyes or even threatened.
It's fascinating how, even with all those consistent reports, there's still no clear picture of what it actually looked like.
Right.
It just adds to the mystery, I guess.
Absolutely. But then things get a little bit darker.
What do you mean?
Well, you've heard of Newell Partridge, right?
Yeah, remind me.
He was a local contractor,
Right.
and he had a really strange experience with something.
Oh, yeah, I remember now.
In December of 1966,
Okay.
he started hearing weird sounds on his property
Okay.
and seeing those red eyes.
Oh.
But then his dogs disappeared,
Oh, no.
vanished without a trace.
Wow. So whatever this thing was, it was more than just passively observing.
Right, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is this creature just curious, or is there something more malevolent going on?
That's a good question. And that question becomes even more urgent when we consider the events that happened a year later, the Silver Bridge collapse.
The Silver Bridge.
Yeah, so December 15th, 1967, this massive bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, it just collapses during rush hour.
Awful tragedy.
Yeah, 46 people died.
And this is where the Mothman story gets really unsettling because several people reported seeing the creature near the bridge.
Really?
Yeah, in the days just before it collapsed.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like a warning sign or a premonition. It's a terrifying thought,
Yeah.
but I can see how people would make that connection.
Yeah, was the Mothman just a witness to this tragedy, or was there something more going on?
Something that caused the collapse.
Exactly. That question has fueled so much speculation and debate.
Right. The idea of a creature that can somehow foresee disaster, it's a really powerful idea.
It's a classic motif in mythology.
It makes you wonder if there's more to the Mothman than just a case of mistaken identity.
Right, and that's one of the more rational explanations for the Mothman, that it was just a misidentified animal.
Like a bird or something.
Yeah, like a sandhill crane. They have a pretty large wingspan.
Okay.
And some reddish markings around their eyes.
But, a crane doesn't really explain those reports of a humanoid figure.
You're right to be skeptical. While a crane might explain some sightings, especially at a distance or in bad lighting,
Right.
it doesn't account for the consistency of those descriptions. People repeatedly reported a tall winged figure with a distinct humanoid shape. And then there's the behavior, the reports of the Mothman following cars appearing in specific locations. It suggests a level of intelligence
Yeah.
and intention
Right.
that doesn't really fit with a bird, even a large one.
Yeah, that's what's always got me the sense that it wasn't just a random animal.
Yeah.
It seemed to be following a pattern, appearing with a purpose.
Yeah.
It makes it even more unsettling.
It does. And that brings us to the theory of mass hysteria.
Okay, so like a shared delusion.
Exactly. Could the social and political climate of the 1960s, combined with the unique circumstances of Point Pleasant,
Right.
have created an environment where this shared delusion could take root?
It's a fascinating idea, especially when you consider how powerful collective fear can be.
Yeah, think about it. The Cold War, the fear of nuclear annihilation.
Right.
And then you add in the proximity of this old munitions plant, the TNT area.
Right.
It's a recipe for unease.
Exactly. It's like the perfect breeding ground for paranoia.
And how news spreads even back then. A
Yeah.
few initial reports may be exaggerated in the retelling. And suddenly everyone's on edge, seeing things in the shadows.
Right.
Interpreting every strange sound as the Mothman.
So it's like a feedback loop. Fear creating sightings and sightings creating more fear.
Exactly.
But wouldn't there have to be something there to start that cycle?
That's the question, isn't it?
Some initial trigger.
Was there a real tangible phenomenon that got misinterpreted
Okay.
and amplified by collective fear?
Right.
Or was the entire thing a product of shared anxieties? It's a tough one to unravel.
It really makes you think about how easily our perceptions can be influenced
Yeah,
by our surroundings and our state of mind.
absolutely. But what about those who believe the Mothman was something more, something beyond our collective imagination?
Okay, let's go there. Let's talk about those more supernatural explanations.
All right, so this is where things get really interesting.
I'm ready.
The idea of the Mothman as a supernatural entity has captured a lot of imaginations.
I can see why.
Some see it as a harbinger of doom, a creature that appears before tragedy strikes.
Like a warning sign.
Exactly, and others believe it might be connected to UFOs or other unexplained phenomena.
Okay, now we're getting into some really mysterious territory.
We are.
What are some of the more out there explanations?
Well, you've got everything from theories about interdimensional beings and psychic projections
Wow.
to ideas about the Mothman being a manifestation of collective anxiety.
It's fascinating how people try to make sense of the unexplainable.
It really is. It speaks to our need to find meaning even in the face of the unknown.
But, before we get too deep into the supernatural,
Yeah.
we should consider some other potential explanations, like the psychological angle.
Right. So the idea that the Mothman sightings could have been a product of mass hysteria, particularly in the context of the time.
Right. This was the height of the Cold War.
Exactly. A time of heightened anxiety and fear.
And then you have the fact that Point Pleasant was located near a former munitions plant.
Right. The TNT area.
That definitely adds to the atmosphere of unease.
Yeah, it does.
So is it possible that all this tension and fear somehow manifested as the Mothman?
It's a compelling possibility. We know that environmental factors can influence our perceptions.
Right.
Even trigger hallucinations.
Okay.
And the idea that a community's collective anxieties could take on a physical form, that's a fascinating idea.
It's almost like the Mothman was a kind of psychological projection, a symbol of all those unspoken fears swirling around Point Pleasant at the time.
It's a very poetic interpretation.
But there's one more theory we haven't talked about yet, the environmental explanation.
Oh, right, the TNT area itself. Oh, could there have been something about that location?
Yeah.
Perhaps some lingering chemicals or electromagnetic fields that caused visual distortions or even hallucinations.
It's an intriguing possibility, especially when you consider the strange noises in the disappearance of Newell Partridge's dogs.
Right.
Could they have been affected by something in the environment as well?
It's definitely worth exploring. If we dig deeper into the environmental history of the TNT area, we might find some clues about the nature of the Mothman.
Okay, so we've got a lot to consider here. Misidentified wildlife, mass hysteria, environmental factors, supernatural entities.
It's a complex puzzle.
The Mothman phenomenon is a tangled web of possibilities. What do you think is the most likely explanation? We'll dive deeper into each of these theories after a quick break.
So we were talking about the Mothman being a case of mistaken identity, like maybe just a big bird.
Yeah, like that sandhill crane.
Right, the sandhill crane.
It does have some of those features.
It does big reddish markings, but
Yeah,
it doesn't really explain all those reports of a humanoid shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. To be skeptical, a crane might explain some sightings, especially if it was dark or far away.
Right.
But it doesn't really explain why people kept saying it was like a person, tall wings, humanoid.
Yeah, and what about the way it acted like following cars and showing up at specific places?
Yeah, that's another thing that doesn't really fit with the bird theory. It seems too intelligent,
But too deliberate.
like it had a plan.
Yeah, that's what makes it so creepy.
So maybe it wasn't a misidentified animal. What about mass hysteria?
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting theory.
Like a shared delusion. Could it be that the social and political climate back then,
The 60s.
yeah, combined with what was going on in Point Pleasant, created this environment where everyone started seeing the same thing?
It's possible. I mean, think about it, the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war.
Exactly. Everyone was on edge.
And then there's that munitions plant, the TNT area.
It's like a recipe for paranoia.
Yeah, and the way news spreads, even back then, you hear a story, maybe it gets exaggerated a little.
Right. And pretty soon everyone's seeing things in the shadows.
Thinking every weird sound is the Mothman.
Exactly. It's a feedback loop. Fear leading to more sightings and more sightings leading to more fear.
But there has to be something to start that loop, right?
Yeah, right. That's the question.
Like, what was the trigger?
Was there something real there that got misinterpreted and blown out of proportion because of the fear?
Right.
Or was the whole thing just a product of everyone's anxieties?
That's a tough one to figure out.
It is, but it makes you think about how our perceptions can be shaped by what's going on around us.
Yeah, and our own state of mind.
Absolutely. But let's move on to the more supernatural explanations. Some people believe the Mothman was something beyond just a figment of our imagination.
Okay, let's talk about that. I love a good supernatural mystery.
So the idea of the Mothman as a supernatural entity, it's really captured the imagination.
Yeah, I can see why.
Some people see it as a harbinger of doom, like it shows up right before something bad happens.
Like a warning.
Exactly. And others think it's connected to UFOs or other strange phenomena.
Now we're getting into some really interesting territory.
We are. So what do you think about these more out there explanations?
I don't know. It's hard to say, but the idea of a creature that can sense or even cause disasters is pretty chilling.
Especially when you think about those sightings near the Silver Bridge before it collapsed.
Right. It's hard to just dismiss that as coincidence.
And those sightings didn't just happen randomly. They seemed to cluster around specific events, like the bridge collapse.
So maybe it's drawn to moments of high energy or emotional turmoil.
That's one interpretation. But even if we entertain the idea of a supernatural entity, it raises even more questions.
Like, what's its purpose?
Right. Why is it showing up in Point Pleasant?
What does it all mean?
These are questions that have puzzled researchers for decades.
And enthusiasts.
Right? Some believe the Mothman might be a guardian spirit trying to warn us of danger.
Interesting.
Others think it's a malevolent force that enjoys chaos and destruction.
Okay.
And of course, there are those who believe it's something completely different, something we can't even comprehend.
It's like the Mothman is a blank slate onto which we project our own hopes and fears.
Our fascination with the unknown, our anxieties about the future.
It's a reflection of ourselves.
In a way, but let's not forget about the last theory, the environmental one.
Right, the TNT area. Could there have been something about that location that caused those sightings?
We know that exposure to certain chemicals or electromagnetic fields can cause hallucinations and other neurological effects.
So is it possible that something lingering in that old munitions plant played a role in the Mothman phenomenon?
Absolutely. And think about the strange noises people reported and the disappearance of Newell Partridge's dogs.
Yeah. Could they have been affected by something in the environment, too?
Maybe if we look into the history in the TNT area, we might find some clues.
Okay, so we've got a lot of possibilities here. Misidentification, mass hysteria, supernatural entities, environmental factors.
There's a lot to think about.
None of them completely explain the mystery, but they each offer a different perspective.
That's what makes the Mothman so fascinating. It's a puzzle with missing pieces, a story that defies easy categorization.
It makes you wonder if we'll ever know the truth.
Maybe not, but even without definitive answers, the Mothman forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, to consider that there might be things in this world we just don't understand.
It's a good reminder that we're still exploring, still trying to make sense of this vast and mysterious universe.
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, there are forces at work, phenomena occurring that we haven't even begun to grasp.
That's a pretty mind-blowing thought.
It is. But for now, we'll have to leave the Mothman mystery hanging.
What do you think is the most likely explanation? We'll explore the legacy of this strange creature after a short break. Okay, so we've talked about the sightings and the theories, but what I find really interesting is how this whole Mothman thing has stuck around.
Yeah, it's true. The Mothman, it's become this global phenomenon, you know?
It's like gone way beyond Point Pleasant.
Right. It's in books, movies, even video games.
I think there's even a Mothman musical.
Probably. There's a whole subculture devoted to it.
Yeah, in Point Pleasant, they even have a Mothman festival every year.
It's amazing they've really embraced it.
Yeah, they haven't shied away from it at all.
It's like this creature that used to scare people is now this source of pride and tourism.
It shows you how our relationship with the unknown is kind of complicated, right?
It is. We want to understand it, but we also kind of enjoy being scared by it.
And I think it also speaks to our love of stories, especially stories that blur the lines between fact and fiction.
Yeah. The Mothman is like a real-life mystery, but with these elements of folklore and the supernatural.
It's a story that's been told and retold so many times.
And changed along the way.
And taken on a life of its own.
Exactly. It's like a modern-day myth, you know?
Yeah, like those ancient stories about creatures lurking in the shadows.
Creatures that represent our fears and our fascination with the unexplained.
But even if we forget about all the supernatural stuff for a minute,
Okay.
we're still left with the question of what those people in Point Pleasant actually saw.
Right. Was it a misidentified animal? A collective hallucination, or something else entirely?
Might be a mystery that we never solve.
That's what makes it so intriguing. It challenges us to think critically,
To look at the evidence.
to consider the possibility that there are things out there that we just don't understand.
It's a reminder that we're still exploring, still trying to figure out this world.
And maybe, just maybe, there are things happening, forces at work that we haven't even begun to comprehend.
So listeners, what do you think is the Mothman? A real creature or a product of our imagination?
We may never know for sure, but that's part of what makes this story so fascinating.
And as we continue to explore the world, both the natural and the supernatural,
We're bound to encounter more mysteries, like the Mothman,
stories that make us question our assumptions.
and push the boundaries of our understanding.
So if you enjoyed our deep dive into the Mothman legend, be sure to like and subscribe to Mystery Stories for more explorations of the unexplained.
And until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might find out there.